All right. Do I have this guy on? I do. Okay, we're looking in chapter 4, verses 43 to 54. And you'll recall that Jesus, he'd been down and he was in Judea. He was returning to Galilee. And he goes to, after his 2 days in the town in Samaria, he continues that journey and he goes to Cana, where he had turned the water into wine. And then in Capernaum, which is about, I mentioned, is about 16 miles. Jesus is in Cana, and Capernaum, as the crow flies, it's about 16 miles. It's further when you take the Roman roads. But there, Jesus in Cana and in Capernaum, there is an unnamed royal official. Now, this is presumably someone who was in the administration of Herod Agrippa, who's the ruler of Galilee and Perea. And so when this unnamed this unnamed official, probably in the administration of Herod Agrippa, when this person hears that Jesus was in Cana, he makes the trek from Capernaum to Cana to ask Jesus to heal his son. His son is gravely ill. He had apparently was aware that Jesus had this reputation of being able to heal. So when he hears that he's there, he makes the journey down, asks him, and he's desperate. But having heard that Jesus can perform miracles, however he came to that knowledge, he wants to go there and ask Jesus. That holds out hope for his gravely ill son. So he goes there and he asks him to do that. And then Jesus responds where he says, unless you people, and it's plural. So he says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And he's not speaking just to this person, as you see from the plural. As Carson says in his commentary, he says these words addressed to the Galileans at large. So it's unless you people, he says, and not just to the royal official, hence the way the NIV translates it to bring out the plural. The NIV says, you people, unless you people. He says, and not just to the royal official, dominate the account and reinforce the impression that the welcome the Galileans accorded Jesus was fundamentally flawed because it was based on too great a focus on miraculous signs. And it's an interesting thing. Like Carson adds, he says, in John's gospel, too much interest in the raw miracles themselves is spiritually dangerous. Miracles cannot compel genuine faith, but the apologetic value of miracles, though often exaggerated, should not be despised. Jesus himself can encourage faith on that basis, especially among those too skeptical to trust his word. So you see, there's kind of this tension with miracles. They are a doorway. They are a way to draw people into faith in Christ. But there's also a sense they can pose a danger if a person simply relies on the miracles and whatever they are. So there's kind of a division there. So in one sense, you can say that simply relying on the miracles, that produces an inadequate or a warped faith, whereas if miracles are simply an invitation and a doorway into something deeper, well, then they serve an apologetic purpose. So you'll see some tension that way in how the miracles function. Now this official, he implores Jesus, he asks him to come to Capernaum, where his son is lying, to come there and heal his son, assuming that it would be necessary for Jesus to make the trip to go there. I mean, he's going to heal. This guy's not thinking he can heal 16 miles away. So he asks him, he implores him to come to Capernaum. He can do that. But Jesus simply tells him, go, your son will live. No, come down here and take care of it. He just says, go, your son will live. And the official took Jesus at his word. This official believed without seeing a sign. And he departed. He comes here and said, will you come down here and heal my son? He says, go, your son will live. All right? And he heads back. And so he takes Jesus there at his word. And then some of his servants. So they were there with him while while the official goes to get Jesus to come to Capernaum to heal him, they're there and they see the son. It's broken. He's okay. He's recovering. So they're on their way to tell him. And so they meet on the road. Some of the servants there, they're coming back to inform the official that his son was recovering. And he found out that, he wants to know, when did this happen? When he changed, when he was gravely ill and then all of a sudden he's recovering. What happened? What time was that? And he learns that was the very hour that Jesus said to him, your son will live. And he's going, You see, he says that. So the belief that he had in Jesus' word, right? So he had believed Jesus' word. When he says up in 50, the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. So that belief that he had there, then it says it's reinforced, and he himself believed. Not only did he believe in a reinforced way, he had believed Jesus when he said go, he goes, but now all his household, you can see he's telling the people in his household. This guy, I went to this guy, and this guy said go and live, and that's when he was healed. So he spreads that. You see, that's how faith is. That's how excitement is about seeing something that is valuable to people. You want to share it. And he's telling it to his household. And they wind up sharing in that. So it's reinforced and then it's transmitted. And John notes that this was the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. And if you're reading along, you go, well, he's done more miracles than that. Yes, but this is the second one when he comes from Judea to Galilee. As Carson says, John is not including the signs performed in Judea. Of those done in Galilee, this was but the second, see 2:11, though many Galileans had witnessed more while they themselves were in the south. So when they were down at the feast in Jerusalem, and Jesus was doing miracles there, he then comes back to Galilee, and this is the second miracle or sign that he performs, having come from Judea to Galilee. Now then we see in 5:1-9. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's always up because it's up on a mountain, okay? So he says he went up to Jerusalem. So he was in Judea and Jerusalem. He goes back up to Galilee. Now he's coming back to Jerusalem. And he says, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades, covered walkways basically, or covered areas. And he says, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who'd been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, do you want to be healed? The sick man answered, sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me. Jesus said to him, get up, take your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Don't let those things just slide by. You've read those things so many times. This guy's been an invalid for 38 years. And he just says to him, take up your mat and walk. And he does. Now that's something. That's something. But sometime later, at an unidentified feast of the Jews, Jesus goes back to Jerusalem. And John mentions a pool in the city in Jerusalem that's located near the sheep gate. And this pool in Aramaic is called Bethesda. And this pool had 5 covered areas, 5 roofed colonnades. Now the sheep gate, it's known to be located, this is, I know, was small, but this is Jerusalem in the 1st century. Here's the city of David here on that tongue that you know. And so here, I know you can't see this, but this is the Temple Mount, right? Here in yellow, here is the temple complex on Herod's larger Temple Mount. And then right here on the north side of the Temple Mount is one of the openings into the Temple Mount that is called the Sheep Gate. And so this is known to have been on the north side of the temple entrance, or on the north side of the mount. Okay? And here is the Sheep Gate is right there. So it's known to be located there. Now we have a copper scroll from Qumran. Okay, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this copper scroll, it's dated before AD 70, and it refers to, in Jerusalem, something that's called Beth Eshdathayin, which is the house of twin pools. You have this reference to a twin pools there in Jerusalem. And Eusebius, who's writing centuries later, the beginning of the 4th century, Eusebius, he also speaks of the pool of Bethesda. He says it has twin pools. The pool of Bethesda that John is referring to. And the pilgrim of Bordeaux, who comes a bit later, he also speaks of this twin pool that is there in Jerusalem. And Eusebius says that this twin pool was in proximity to the temple area. Okay, so we know the Sheep Gate's on the north. You have John talking about that near the Sheep Gate. We have this idea of these, he says it's 5 colonnades. We know there was a twin pool area in Jerusalem here. And so shortly after, in the 5 roof colonnades, you say, how does that work? Why is that relevant to the twin pools? Well, that's how you get the 5 roofed colonnades. Think of it, I have 2 pools here. I don't have a rectangle here, okay? But think of the 2 rectangle pools. And so where are the 5 colonnades? I have 1 covering on that side, 1 covering on this side, 1 covering on this side, 1 covering on that side. So I have the 4 on the perimeter of the twin pools, and then I have a 5th colonnade going between them. Okay, so you have 5 colonnades, 5 covered areas on the perimeter, and then in between the twin pools. So that's why the twin pools is significant to the 5 colonnades. That's how you wind up getting that. And then shortly after the turn of the 20th century, 2 large pools were found north of the north wall on the Temple Mount. Okay? So here's the Sheep Gate on the north wall. And after the 20th century, we find 2 large pools just north, right there where Eusebius had said, see, in the vicinity of the vicinity of the temple. Now we have and they're dug into stone, and they're plastered. They're cut into rock and they're plastered. And then we have many fragments. You see, archaeologically, fragments of column bases and capitals and drums which were found. And archaeologist John McRay, he says these remains that I just showed you, these remains probably belonged to the 5 porches, that is the porticos or colonnaded walkways of the pool John mentions. And I just always think it's neat, you know, when you sit here, how historical these things are. This isn't some, mythological thing. This is reality. Here's the pool of Bethesda right there where John said it was. And we wind up finding that and discovering that, and I think that's significant. Now, many disabled people, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, they would lie in these covered areas, obviously staying out of the sun. You know, you can relate to that in Phoenix, right? I always joke. Somebody's waiting on a bus and they're trying to get the shade from a lamp pole. Sitting here like this. But so they would lie around these pools in these covered areas. And because as indicated in verse 7, they're doing that because they believe the water in these pools could heal at certain times. In other words, when they thought, when the water became turbulent, as it did periodically. Now, it probably did that because of underground springs that would pulse So, but they thought that periodically, at least, there was a superstition and a belief among the people there that when the waters are roiled, if you get down in there and you're the first person in, well, then you'll be healed. So that's why you say, why are they lying around these pools? That's why they had that idea that that's what would happen. Now, many later manuscripts include some additional, in fact, if you have a certain version, it may. There are many later manuscripts include additional wording after this period here, and then also include a verse 4. But you'll notice, like the English Standard Version and many other modern English translations, just show the verse 4, but there is no text there. All right, so you have some manuscripts, much later manuscripts, that have additional language, a 3b, and then an additional verse 4. But as I say, modern translations don't do that, and they don't do that because that almost certainly is not part of what John wrote. Let me read to you the New English translation. This is just a textual issue, okay? But if you're reading along, sometimes you see additional text and you go, why didn't this guy have that? And I'm explaining to you why the ESV and modern translations don't have that. It's not that they don't like the Bible, it's that they're trying to find out what was actually written by John. Okay, what was inspired by John. And here the New English translation note says, the majority of later manuscripts add the following to chapter 5, verse 3, waiting for the moving of the water. Okay, so that's additional text that's not in the ESV, for example. And then add 5:4. For an angel of the Lord went down and stirred up the water at certain times. Whoever first stepped in after the stirring of the water was healed from whatever disease which he suffered. The note goes on and says other manuscripts include only that extra part of verse 3, and some only verse 4. Okay? But it says few textual scholars. A textual scholar is somebody whose world is built around how do we derive an original text when we don't have the original, but we have thousands of copies and translations. How does one get back to the original text? And there are a lot of factors that go into it, and it's a whole field of study. Okay, it doesn't just depend on the most ancient manuscripts, but that's significant. But there are a lot of other factors that play into it, knowing the types of errors that are made by copyists and all these things. So we work to say, okay, what was the original text? It says few textual scholars today would accept the authenticity of any portion of 3b, the added part of verse 3, or verse 4. For they are not found in the earliest and best witnesses. The papyrus manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of John don't have them, for example. The great manuscripts don't have it. All right, well, that's very significant. They include un-Johannine vocabulary and syntax. Several of the manuscripts that include the verses mark them as spurious. In other words, whoever's doing it, the scribe who's copying it, makes a note and says, this is bunk. Okay, but cops, and they do it with an asterisk or an obelisk. And he says, because there's a great amount of textual diversity among the witnesses that do include them. In other words, they're not uniform. All right, so I just point that out to you. You say, why is that no 3b or no 4? Why does it have 4 and no text listed there? So that was free of charge. All right, now a man who had been disabled for 38 years, he's among those who are surrounding the pools. 38 years is a long time. Now, I don't know how he was disabled, what happened to him, but he'd been disabled for 38 years, and he's there. And Jesus saw him and knew that he'd already been there for a long time. I think meaning that he knew he'd been coming to the pool for a long time, or that he had been in that condition for a long time. And in asking the man, Jesus asked the man, he says, do you want to be healed? Now, we often take that, the way, I don't think it's as we often claim that Jesus is asking the person, do you really want to get well? In other words, is that something you really desire? Asking him, look, do you deep down, would you really prefer to live with the familiarity of being a disabled person? I don't think that's what Jesus is doing. I mean, the man clearly is eager to be healed. I assume it's not easy for this invalid to get dragged to this pool. But there he is at the pool, and he's wanting to get in. So I think he wants to be healed. Rather, I think the question is intended to suggest to the man that Jesus is able to heal him. You know, I was thinking of an example. Like if you said to somebody who was just desperate for a ticket to a championship game in some sport, and you said to him, "Do you want to go to the game? Do you want to go to the game?" You see, well, you could see, depending on your tone of voice, you could be intimating to the person that I can arrange that. I have the ability to make that happen. Do you want to go to the game? I can get you tickets. And I think it's more along those lines. I think Jesus is seeking to awaken this person to the truth of his identity when he says that. Now, the man takes the question as we often do. He takes that question as an inquiry into the sincerity of his desire. So that's how he reads it, which prompts him to explain that it's not a lack of desire on his part that keeps him from being healed. That's not why he hasn't been healed. It's not that he doesn't want to be healed. He certainly wants to be healed, but it's the fact that his disability, it prevents him from entering the pool on his own. He can't get up and get into the pool, and he doesn't have anybody to carry him into the pool so that he's the first one in. Because the common thinking was the healing goes to the first one in. And so he's sitting here thinking like that. He says, no, that's not it, you see. I can't do it on my own, and I have nobody who will help me. So he buys into the shared belief that the healing was provided to the first person. That's simply part of what he's grown up with thinking. As Colin Kruse says, he says, later tradition reflected in the additions to the text in 5:3b and 4 attributed the stirring of the waters to an angel, but it's more likely to have been caused by the movement of subterranean water. So there apparently in these twin pools, there was periodic roiling of the water. The common idea, at least in some strata of the society, was that, listen, if you get in when this is happening, first one in gets healed. But as Köstenberger says, official Judaism almost certainly did not approve of the superstition associated with the alleged healing powers of the pool of Bethesda. After all, healing shrines were characteristic of pagan cults. Apparently, however, the authorities looked the other way, tolerating this expression of popular religion. And you can see how authorities, if the people think this, and they're hanging out and doing that, they don't endorse it. They don't want to promote it, but I can see them with the hands off because they don't want to cause trouble. And so they just let the people go on. I think that's probably what has been going on with this idea. Now, the healed cripple, so this, I think that's what's happening here. All right, so Jesus now, without any indication of faith on the part of this person, Jesus simply tells him, he says, get up, take your bed, and walk. So he tells him that. And he's healed immediately by the word of Jesus. That's how he just says it, and the person is healed immediately. He takes up his bed, which was normally, it's a mat made of straw, so he doesn't have to lie on the hard ground. But it's nothing, it's not like some air mattress or something. It's just this mat made of straw, but it provides some comfort. He takes it and he winds up, he walks with it. And as Grant Osborne says, the healing was done apart from the pool. It had nothing to do with the pool, right? And it was not an angel, which I think was a later idea, and but the Son of God who was at work. That's what Jesus tells him. Now, so that's kind of the setup. That's what happened. Jesus has healed this person. And then we see in 9b to 18. Now, that was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who'd been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who's the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who'd been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews, after this encounter in the temple, told the Jews it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, he's a killer. Jesus answered, he says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. He's got them just pulling their hair out. Their heads are exploding. I mean, they're just like, they're losing their minds. He said this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So they come after him. They're going to bully him. They're going to push him around. Just never works. You see, it absolutely never works. Now, the healing was on a Sabbath, and by carrying his mat, as Jesus had instructed him, the man was violating the Pharisees' interpretation of the divine command not to work on the Sabbath. Okay, and you see that command not to work many places in the Old Testament: Exodus 20, 23, 31, 34, Numbers 15, Deuteronomy 5, Nehemiah 13, Jeremiah 17. Now, according to this oral tradition of the Pharisees, and that tradition, by the way, was later written down. It was later codified around AD 200 in a work known as the Mishnah. Okay, so we have this oral tradition of the Pharisees, and according to that tradition, the command in the Old Testament not to work, well, that command prohibited one from carrying a load from one domain to another. Okay, in other words, if you just carry it within the domain, however that's defined, whether it's household, but if you carry the load from one domain to another, well, then you have violated the commandment that you're not to work on the Sabbath. And though they recognized exceptions to that command not to work, they recognized exceptions for defensive warfare and in matters of life and death. So they did recognize exceptions. But these Jewish leaders, they gave absolutely no thought to the possibility that the prohibition, even as they conceived it, that the prohibition was never intended to cover, to apply to the case of a former cripple carrying his mat as visual testimony to and in celebration of his miraculous healing. That doesn't even occur to them. That it was not designed or intended, even if we take the oral tradition view of it. Was it intended to stifle the demonstration of this miraculous healing? Those kinds of questions apparently didn't register. And they tell the man, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your mat. And the healed cripple, he defends himself by saying, the man who healed me. I've been a cripple for 38 years, and the guy who healed me, he said, take up your mat. What do you think I'm going to do? Think I'm going to tell you nobody? I don't think I'll do what you want, even though you just healed me. I've been crippled for 38 years. He's the guy who told me to do it. So that's what I was doing. I was doing that. And that then prompts the leaders to ask for the identity of the person who gave this instruction. So they want to know, all right, if that's what happened, then you tell me who was it who gave you that instruction. And the healed man did not know the identity of his healer. And since Jesus by that time had gone into the crowd, he couldn't point him out. He couldn't say, all right, I don't know who, that guy. He couldn't point him out because he'd already, there was a big group of people there. So Jesus was already gone. And then Jesus later finds the man in the temple. And he reminds him that he had healed him. He says to him, see, you are well. He reminds the man that he had healed him to add weight to the admonition he's going to deliver to him. You see, you're well, right? Now, you know I did that, right? You were crippled. You're now well. I'm the one who made you well. Now you listen to what I'm telling you. And he gives this admonition, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. He was calling this man to surrender his life to God, to commit himself to a life of righteousness, to seek God with all of his heart and mind and will. All of that. He's calling him to be that kind of person, that he not experience a judgment far worse than his prior disability. As Grant Osborne comments, he says, Jesus challenged the man to get right with God, lest he face divine judgment for sin, which is far worse than simple illness. As bad as these things can be, as bad as being an invalid, and people carry burdens in this world that I can't fathom. But as difficult and as bad as it, he's telling him there are things that are far worse. And I'm telling you that judgment is far worse. So Osborne says, challenge the man to get right with God, lest he face divine judgment for sin, which is far worse than simple illness. This was more than a moral challenge. Jesus offered the man life from above. He had shown a glimmer of faith when he responded to Jesus' command by getting up and carrying his mat. Now he had to make the second step and turn from sin to God. He had to choose between life and judgment. There was no middle ground. No middle ground. You give God your all. You turn to him and say, oh, all right. And then when you do that, that surrender and submission is inevitably reflected in your life. You cannot have a heart that is fully surrendered to God. And I want you, your way in my life, what you say, what you want, that's what. And then to think that that won't manifest in how I live. Of course it will. So that's the point. That's what he's saying to him. And then the man, then he goes to the Jews who had said, who was it who told you that? He says, I don't know who the guy was. Jesus then comes, makes his identity clear to the guy in delivering that admonition to him. And the guy then goes to the Jewish leaders and he identifies Jesus. He fingered him as the one who had healed him and thus the one who had instructed him to carry his mat on the Sabbath. That's who did it. He's the one who healed me. He's the one who told me to do that. Now the leaders, they then got after Jesus. They got after him because he was doing these things on the Sabbath, referring to the healing itself. He's doing these things, referring to the healing itself and to the instruction to the healed person to carry his mat on the Sabbath. And then Jesus responds to him. He says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. I say, well, hey, how are you doing this stuff on the Sabbath? You're violating, you're going against God. And so Jesus tells him that. Now, you need to understand something about how Jewish consensus, how they view things. So after completing his work of miraculously creating the founding state of the universe over the course of 6 days, as you see in Genesis 2, and 3, Exodus 20:11, after having completed his work of miraculously creating the founding state of the universe, the initial state from which all subsequent states descended through secondary causes. In other words, he creates Adam and Eve as an example. They then have children, secondary causes. So he creates the founding state of the universe over 6 days, and then things descend from that founding state through secondary causes. Well, after he had created that founding state miraculously, God ceased, he rested from that specific creative work. He rested from that. The writer of Hebrews explains that God's seventh day rest at creation, his ceasing of that specific creation work, the writer of Hebrews says that his seventh day rest at creation continues. He remains abstaining from that specific creation work, and that points ultimately to the rest of God's people. And you see that in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 3 to 11. But, so they all understood that there was this rest from that creative work of God, that specific creative work of miraculously creating the founding state of the universe. But it was understood that God at no time was inactive in creation. The Jews understood that. Yes, he ceased from the founding work of miraculously creating this initial state. But they understood that at no time was he inactive in creation, but rather he was perpetually at work. Perpetually at work in sustaining the creation even on Sabbath days. Okay, and we have, like Carson says, the consensus was that God works on the Sabbath. For otherwise, providence itself would go into weekly abeyance. What do you think happens? Who do you think holds everything together? So do you think that all of a sudden God just stops doing anything? Well, if God stopped doing anything, what do you think would happen to existence? So they understood that. F.F. Bruce, he expresses the Jewish consensus. He says God was active all the time on Sabbath days as much as on ordinary days. So in justifying his healing work on the Sabbath, they come after him and they say, listen, you're breaking the Sabbath by doing that. In justifying his healing work on the Sabbath by appeal to the fact that God works on the Sabbath without violating the commandment against work. God works on the Sabbath without violating that commandment. Jesus is identifying himself with God in a way that would be improper for a mere mortal. Right? You are all subject to these things, he says, but God is working on the Sabbath and he's not violating this. I'm like he is. He's identifying himself with God. He's claiming that God was his father in a unique sense. God is his father in a unique sense. See, one that allowed him, because of their unique relationship, it allowed him to appeal to God's conduct in sustaining things on the Sabbath as authorization for his own. A mere mortal couldn't make that claim. But Jesus says, because I and the Father are like this, I can appeal to his working and ongoing work on the Sabbath as justification for mine. And they're not stupid. They understood what he was saying. This is why it says that's why the Jews were seeking to kill him all the more. You see, they knew what he was saying. And so they're losing their mind. They're already after him for the Sabbath, but now they're after him all the more. They're going crazy. Not only was he, in their eyes, breaking the Sabbath, not only was he doing that by healing and instructing the recipient of the miracle to take up his mat and walk, but he also was calling God his own Father in a sense that made himself equal with God so that he could appeal to God's authorization to work on the Sabbath as his own. And so it says here, but he was even calling God his own Father. Well, in what sense? In the sense of making himself equal with God. Now that's serious, right? That's very serious. So Jesus said to them, here in 1930, I heard that first bell, but that's how life is. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, or I solemnly declare, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father do. I can just imagine these people. Like I said, they think they're going to come here and theologically bully Jesus and say, listen, and he entangles them, and I can just see them going, what is this guy saying? What are we doing? But he says, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these will he show him, so that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who've done good to the resurrection of life, and those who've done evil to the resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Now, I wish we had more time, but I heard that bell. Next week, Lord willing.